Welcome to History Where It Happened. I'm Dick Smith. Today's show is about the Civil War and the tragic events that happened there. We're starting out here in Shaftesbury and we'll end up here in Shaftesbury. I hope you enjoy the show. For the decades prior to the Civil War, the Underground Railroad, which was active throughout the United States to help runaway slaves get to Canada, was also active here in Vermont. One of the main routes of the Underground Railroad was up the western side of Vermont. 7A had not really been completed yet, and this is Old Depot Road. This was one of the main routes north-south, and this was one of the routes used by runaway slaves to go to various safe houses on the way to Canada. Slaves really didn't feel safe in Vermont totally. Although we banned slavery in our Constitution, federal law said that a bounty hunter could basically come to Vermont and take a runaway slave back. So most of the slaves went to a safe house and then the next day tried to move on using an agent or something to another safe house and so on, all the way north through Manchester and all the way to Canada. One of the safe houses that is documented, and a lot of these safe houses, varying degrees of documentation. There's always arguments and letters and so on. But one of the well-documented safe houses happens to be from the Simon house behind us. The Simon Bottom house. The Bottom family lived all throughout this area, and they protected slaves in that house. In Manchester itself, we also participated in the Northshire. Judge Pettibone, who you normally don't associate with being involved with the Underground Railroad, actually hid a runaway slave for a couple of years and never told anyone. It was Richard Skinner, his son Mark Skinner. The library is named after him. He acted as an agent and so on. So Manchester, the Northshire, and Vermont was very active in the Underground Railroad. April 12, 1861, Fort Sumner in the harbor of Charleston Harbor was fired upon. The Civil War had begun. The Union thought the war was only going to be about 3 months, but they were wrong and they realized it. So they put out the call after 3 months to open a recruiting office. So Manchester responded and opened a recruiting office on the second floor of what is now known as the Equinox Shops or Equinox Junior. Recruits came in from everywhere. They were called the Equinox Guards. Some of the recruits trained, some of them marched down to Factory Point, some of them came back here. Some of the recruits were not from Manchester Village. So those that were not from here slept over at the courthouse, which was built in 1822, and in Vanderlip's Hotel, which are the south sections of the Equinox today. The Equinox had not been formed yet, and that was Vanderlip's Hotel. Now let's go visit the home of one of the most important recruits of the Equinox Guards. We're here in Manchester Village, about 4 houses down from the 1811 house. We're at the office of Joe O'Day's law firm. But the reason, who has graciously allowed us to film here, the purpose of being here is that this was the childhood home of Charles Dudley. Charles Dudley became the captain of the Equinox Guard. Charles Dudley was originally a marble cutter and a teacher. He eventually was studying law. Then when the Civil War broke out in 1861, he actually enlisted in Rutland for 3 months. There were a lot of these 3-month regiments. He enlisted for 3 months. The 3 months were up. He came back to Manchester and enlisted in the Manchester Equinox Guards at the recruiting station up here in Manchester Village. Unfortunately, he went down to Savage Station and he lived through Savage Station, but 3 years later at Spotsylvania, he was wounded and he died on May 29th, 1864. But that was Charles Dudley. He actually also went on to be colonel in the regiment, the 5th Regiment, of which the Equinox Guards were part of. So he was quite successful and very important to the Equinox Guards. He was also the elected officer of it. He wasn't appointed, and he was from Manchester. He was born in Manchester. Now, Let's go to some of the other places where some of the Equinox Guards trained. We're now in Barnumville. This is Barnumville Road. In the early 1800s, this was pretty deserted, but they built the Peru Turnpike. The Peru Turnpike actually came down from Peru past Mistrals, which was at the time a toll gate, and it went down this route, which is now closed off, went up High Meadow, North Street, and then on down to Salem, and then on down to Saratoga, and that was then used by the stagecoach. So we had a stage route going in the same direction. Well, when you get a stagecoach and a road, you need a tavern, and the Brick Tavern was built to satisfy these customers. For many years, this was known as the Brick Tavern District. Well, this area here was also the area where a lot of the people who enlisted in the Equinox Guards trained. One of those groups that, or families that had moved into the area were the Cummings, and they were 5 Cummings brothers. This is where they trained. Now let's go visit the house of Henry Cummings, one of the Cummings brothers. We're now on Johnny Cake Street. We're about a half a mile from Barnumville. And just as an aside, Johnny Cake, of course, was a food. It was a cornmeal, I believe, that was used in the South by several of the soldiers, or a lot of the soldiers. A lot of the Cummings family lived in the Johnny Cake area. Some of the relatives, the in-laws and so on, lived in Winhall. We're right near Winhall, but that's up this way. All the Cummings brothers were born here in Manchester. Behind me is the home of Henry Cummings. Henry was the oldest of the Cummings brothers. He enlisted when he was 38. The Cummings brothers at the time, by the time they had all enlisted, they didn't realize they would become part of the most tragic event in the Civil War. In September of 1861, that's about 4 months after the start of the Civil War, the Equinox Guards, wherever they were training, whether it was in Barnumville, whether it was up in the village, or both, and from people from other towns, they all mustered in Manchester Village. In Manchester Village, they left to go on the train to go off to war. On September 12th, the Equinox Guards in great fanfare marched down Union Street, then cut over and went to the Manchester Railroad Station. The railroad station itself has actually not changed much. It looks the same. It came to Manchester in 1853, and it's now part of R.K. Miles. On September 12th, that train left, and that train left Manchester, and it came through Manchester, and we're still in Manchester now, and it came up these tracks heading north to St. Albans, which is about 130 miles to the north. They were going up there, the Equinox Guards, were going up there to join other Vermont groups. They left, it was 130 miles. In St. Albans, they became not the Equinox Guards, but officially Company E of the 5th Vermont Regiment Infantry. Well, they were up there about 4 days, and on September 16th, they actually left St. Albans and went down to Virginia to camp for the winter. At the end of the winter, they entered battle, and that was the Battle at Savage Station. Savage Station is now a cloverleaf between I-64 and I-295, I believe. That battle was devastating to the Equinox Guards. The Cummings brothers were there. There were 5 Cummings brothers, a brother-in-law and a cousin, and their captain was Charles P. Dudley. And they were all in that battle. And that battle was so important that I'm going to read some quotes that have been said of that battle to show how dramatic it was. The first quote was, "Within 30 minutes, the 5th Vermont Regiment suffered the greatest casualties of any Vermont regiments in a single battle. Company E, the Equinox Guards, suffered the greatest loss of any company from Vermont. The Cummings family was the greatest mortality suffered in any one family in the Union for either a single battle or during the war." And I'll repeat that. The Cummings family was the greatest mortality suffered in any one family in the Union for either a single battle or during the war. Manchester was totally devastated. And when you think about that train coming here to take these people, the Equinox Guards, up to St. Albans, that was really the last time that that unit was seen in Manchester. Now we fast forward 2 years to 1864. In 1864, Charles Dudley, who was captain of the Equinox Guard, had been wounded at Spotsylvania and he died. His funeral was in the Congregational Church, which was located right here. It's a little to the south of the current church. The newer church had been moved. It was a standing room only event, as you can imagine, captain of the Equinox Guards. But another ironic event happened that year. Mary Todd Lincoln, wife of President Abraham Lincoln in that summer of 1864, visited Manchester. Where she stayed was the Equinox House, which were the northern two units of the current Equinox Hotel, because the Equinox Hotel had not been combined yet with the Vanderlips Hotel. But it was just kind of sad that she came here to get away from the heat and the chaos of the war in Washington. She ended up staying opposite the church where the funeral for Charles Dudley was. She stayed opposite where the Equinox Guards had trained. She stayed opposite where the Equinox Guards left to go down Union Street to the train station to go to war, and many of them just never came back. During that visit in 1864, she brought her son, Robert Todd Lincoln, from Harvard. He was about 20 or 21 years old. The following year, of course, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated and the Civil War was over. Savage Station and the loss of the Cummings family were tragic events, but fortunately we have a lot of reminders that lives were not lost in vain. One of the reminders of this is behind me in the War Memorial. On the south side is the plaque for all the Civil War veterans from here in Manchester. And on there, if you take the time and walk around, you'll see all the Cummings names listed. All the Cummings brothers, the brother-in-law and the cousins and so on are on that plaque. The entire monument itself was made by W.H. Fullerton, which had his operation down here in Manchester Depot. It is now the executive offices of the R.K. Miles Company. That company produced over 30,000 gravestones for the Civil War deceased. And it's really ironic in a way that the same train station that took the Equinox Guards to their famous battle at Savage Station is also the same train station that took all the gravestones out of Manchester from the Fullerton operation. This is the gravestone of Henry Cummings, 5th Infantry, Company E. That's all it says on the gravestone. This is really tragic in my view because Henry Cummings was the oldest of the Cummings brothers. Remember, he lost 4 of his brothers, a brother-in-law and a cousin in the war. He enlisted when he was 38. He was shot in the knee at Savage Station and crippled. He didn't die till many years later. His parents had died before the Civil War. So here he was. He died alone. He basically died alone. And when you look at the grave, here it is, a very simple grave, sort of wonderfully out in the field here, literally, with no other graves around. It's also interesting on the gravestone, there's no date of death, date of birth, or anything else, just Company E. These people were so loyal in their units, that's what they wanted on their gravestone. But Henry Cummings was the oldest of the 5 Cummings brothers that died at the Battle of Savage Station, June 29, 1862. We're here in the Factory Point Cemetery, and I just wanted to point out another one of these gravestones, which is really symbolic of a lot of the Civil War graves here. But this is of George Lemming, and it says, killed at the Battle of Savage Station, June 29, 1862. This is very typical of how important that was in Manchester. A lot of the graves here just refer to Savage Station. It was so important in the town of Manchester and the greater Northshire. This happens to be a memorial that was put up by the Skinner Women's Relief Corps, which was part of the GAR, but it's 1861 to 1865, a memorial to all our Union soldiers. and it's very important because there are a lot of Civil War graves in this cemetery. But if you get a chance to visit this beautiful cemetery, stop by and pay your respects. We're here in Dellwood Cemetery to look at some other reminders of the tragic event of the Civil War. Here we're at the gravestone of Charles P. Dudley, who of course was the captain of the Equinox Guards, and he went on to be head of the entire 5th Vermont Volunteer Regiment. He died in May 21st, 1864, the same year Mary Todd Lincoln visited Manchester. What a tragedy. The flag is put out by the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic, and there are a lot of other reminders in Dellwood Cemetery of Civil War veterans. Behind us is Benjamin Stone Roberts, who was a general in the Civil War. And there are some other graves here. Over here is Richard Skinner, who apparently acted as an agent during the Underground Railroad. So there are a lot of people here that participated in some way in the Civil War. We're in Dellwood Cemetery now, in another location. This is the memorial to J.S. Pettibone. J.S. Pettibone was actually Judge John S. Pettibone. The Pettibone name is very big here in Manchester. Judge Pettibone's father, Samuel Pettibone, purchased the original house built in Manchester from Samuel Rose, who became a Tory. And he has a lot of descendants here. Judge Pettibone, to show his courage, he actually hid a runaway slave from the South in his house and didn't tell anyone. So a lot of people here in Manchester were contributed to the Civil War, a lot in the whole greater Northshire. And there are a lot of these stories in Dellwood Cemetery, but this is a lingering memory of the Civil War. We're back in Shaftesbury now. For those of you who have seen the film Lincoln, you know one of the great reminders of the Civil War and one of the greatest outputs, positive, was the constitutional amendment that banned slavery. Well, the constitutional amendment that banned slavery, the sole author was Jacob Merritt Howard, and he was born here in Shaftesbury. He was educated in Bennington and Brattleboro. He left for Michigan in his 20s, but his values were here in Vermont. If you saw the film Lincoln, you also realize, or remember, Robert Todd Lincoln was in that film. And of course, Robert Todd Lincoln, who had visited the Equinox Hotel in 1864, built his family home and moved in 1905. 2 Lincoln descendants are buried in Dellwood Cemetery. So there's a lot of Lincoln connections here. And that was the positive aftermath of the Civil War. I hope you enjoyed today's show, and it was just a quick look at where some of these events happened, and I hope you take the time to visit some of these sites and read more. There's plenty of books on the Civil War in the Northshire and the greater Northshire. See you at the next episode.